Hello, and welcome back, I guess I should say, to Business Lessons from the Military. We've been on hiatus for the last few weeks because of some health problems. That's life, but happy to be back and looking forward to getting back into our topic of dealing each Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern on our topic of looking at military doctrine, military history, great military leaders, and how we can take those lessons and apply them to our businesses and our professional lives in order to make them more successful. So, anxious to get started. We're going to continue with our discussion of Marine Corps doctrine, but we are going to deal with a different topic starting today, and that is we're going to be talking about cultural competency. Now, I am not going to be talking about this from a political perspective. Don't talk politics here. Our purpose is commerce, as I like to note. But we are going to get into some, I think, topics that are topical. they're really kind of at the forefront of what a lot of businesses are in some cases doing very well with, and in other cases struggling with. So as always, because this is a military related training, got to have a PowerPoint. And so we're going to jump right in, and let's see. Here we go. There we go. See, and it's got that, as I always like to note, that cool, military looking background, right? Not by accident. Okay. So, oops, let's see. There we go. So, I just want to take a moment to remind you about the 3 pillars of attainment. This is the concept on which all of the Way to Wow shows are based. We're dealing primarily in the pursuits pillar and primarily in finances, but we'll also deal with relationships. And in today's topic, relationships are going to be a significant part, as is self, in particular, our identity. Okay, and here in relationships, we're really talking primarily about friends, in which we would include work colleagues, clients, etc. Okay, so that's the foundation for everything we do. Okay, so cultural literacy and competency. Excuse me. When we talk about cultural literacy, what we're talking about is understanding cultural backgrounds and how they impact how people behave, how they work, how they think, how they approach issues, problems, solutions, etc. Okay, and I think we'd all agree that it is virtually impossible to escape our cultural background. Okay, it was essentially plugged into us from our very first breath, almost. Okay, and so the key, and I'm not going to get into which culture is good or which culture is bad. That's not our topic here. Okay, our topic is to understand what is cultural background and how do we understand it. Okay, so just before I started the training, I was meeting with a friend of mine that I hadn't seen for a while, and we were talking about a situation in which I'm involved. And I was explaining to him how this particular person was in a big dispute with someone else. And when I was told about the dispute, in this case, it was a family matter, I said to the person, well, I mean, knowing the other person as I do, it doesn't surprise me that what's going on is upsetting the other person. After all, this person has a very deeply held value on this topic. And so it really, I suspect, hit a very deep chord with them. Okay, to which the person I was speaking to said, oh, I don't care, basically, right? So my friend that I was meeting with this morning, he made an observation. I hadn't really thought about this, but it's something that he's very clued into. He said, see, the ability to understand and see issues and matters through somebody else's eyes, that's what we call EQ, emotional EQ, emotional intelligence. It's like IQ, but which is just intelligence. EQ is emotional intelligence, right? That's what we want to develop. And in fact, there are studies that show that a high EQ is a better determiner of success than a high EQ. Okay, so this idea of understanding cultural background and how it impacts how people think and behave is very crucial to our success. And I would say, and this includes me, we're probably not nearly as good at it as we think we are, right? We've always got to be working to gain greater understanding, okay? So let's start by talking a little bit about what is cultural background. Well, according to Marine Corps warfighting doctrine, and that's the basis for this training, cultural background really has kind of three aspects to it. One is self-definition, the second is expression, and the third is relationships. Okay, so as we look at these, self-definition is the way a person views himself. Okay, so I'm going to use myself as an example, right? Self-definition. I'm Jewish. Okay, that's a big part of my cultural background. And no matter how hard I would try to escape it, it's just a part of me. Okay, earlier today, I was listening to some classic comedy recordings on Sirius. And you know, there's so many Jewish comedians, and one of them, I can't remember who it was, but anyway, he was talking about the difference between how, you know, Jews and non-Jews you know, deal with their homes. And he's like, non-Jews, you go in the house and they can fix this and they can fix that. And they're not really that concerned about their house because if it falls down, they can build it right back up again. He says, Jews can't do any of that, right? And on a certain level, it's really true. He says, for Jews, it's all about showing off the house, right? Now, of course, this comedy comes from back in the 70s. I'm sure some people would consider it, you know, anti-Semitic or whatever. Of course, it was a Jewish guy who was saying it, but you know, as I'm listening to this, and I'm thinking about like my grandmother, and to a certain extent, even my parents, is like, yeah, you know, there were rooms in our house when I was growing up where we kids were basically not allowed. It's like, you don't go in the living room unless it's to clean, right? Because the living room is the room to like show off, right? There's no escaping that that background. And if you were to come into my house, you know, I have to really sort of, you know, restrain myself from wanting to show you my house. It's small, but it's like, you know, oh, and look, here's what I did here, and here's this, and here's that. It's like, you know, it's a cultural thing, right? So self-definition then is how we see ourselves, how we define ourselves, okay? That's one part of our cultural background. The next part is expression, how we communicate, okay? You know, again, I'll tell a joke. So there's a rabbi and a minister are talking one day. They're having a coffee, you know, kind of inter-religious, meeting or whatever. And so the minister is talking to the rabbi, and he says, Rabbi, I'd like to ask you a few questions. Rabbi says, oh, of course, go ahead. So the minister, he says, why, when I go into your synagogue, are people praying so loud? And two, why, when I go to your funerals, people are, I'm sorry, and why, when I go into your synagogues, there's so much stuff going on, and there's the kids are running around and all this stuff. And finally, why, when I go to a Jewish funeral, people are so demonstrably fraught? So the rabbi says, listen, these are all very good questions. He says, let me give you some answers. He says, first of all, with praying so loud, he says, listen, we're praying to the Father, you're praying to the Son. The Father, a little hard of hearing. We got to pray real loud for him to hear. Okay? And with all the balagan, we call it in the synagogue, he says, we make a synagogue is like our home. So we have the people here running around and the children and whatever. And the minister says, okay, I understand. What about the third one? He says, the rabbi says, well, to tell you the truth, I like your way better. Right? The ways of expressing are different among different cultural groups. Okay, I'm not, I don't, you don't have to worry. I'm not going to change my day job. I'm not going to become a comedian. But people have different ways of expressing themselves. And a lot of that comes from their culture, right? I grew up in a very loud house. And the first time I had an apartment with two friends and something went wrong and I'm screaming, right? And they're looking at me like, where did you come from? And so they just, both of them, they just stand there until after literally about 5 minutes of me screaming, I noticed they're not saying or doing anything, which was really weird for me because that's not how it worked in my family. And I stopped. And one of them looked at me and said, okay, you cannot do that ever again. I'm thinking to myself, this is really weird, okay? Because they didn't scream back. That was just not my cultural norm. And it was really the first time I realized there was another way of settling conflict besides each person screaming at the other person. Okay? They came from a different cultural background. People didn't scream at each other. They sat down, they said, here's the problem I have with what you're doing or what you're saying or whatever. And okay, now we got to figure out a solution, right? It was truly eye-opening for me. I was, I think, 16 or 17 when that happened. Okay, so expression is another part of cultural background. And then finally, relationships, okay? How people form relationships, how people prioritize relationships, with whom people create relationships. All of this is affected by their cultural background. Okay, so here in the United States, for example, and this comes from a book called Against Fairness. I believe it was written by Steve Asma. He's a professor of, I think it's psychology, but I could be wrong about that. So he's talking about how here in the United States, when somebody favors their family members over non-family members, that's called nepotism, and we view that negatively. Okay, we're not supposed to, I mean, in a family business, maybe, but in a publicly run company, a publicly owned company, or in, government employment, in a university, something like that, it is considered wrong to favor our family members over other people. Everybody's supposed to compete essentially, fairly, which is why the book is named Against Fairness. Now, in China, he points out, it's exactly the opposite. It would be considered a grave faux pas to overlook your family members in favor of somebody outside of the family. That is just not how it's done. Okay, so what we call nepotism and bad here in this country, in China, it's exactly the opposite. I don't know what they would call it. I don't know Chinese, but they would call it, in essence, honoring their family. And to not do so would be considered bad. Okay, so the key thing about understanding these parts of cultural background is then, how do we apply them to gaining cultural literacy and competency? Okay, so let's move on with that. All right, so the first thing we need to do is to become literate ourselves. Okay, and we do that, first of all, by understanding our own beliefs, values, behaviors, and norms. Okay, uncritically, just understand what they are. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Okay, I was raised to think that wealthy people had all become wealthy because they were essentially dishonest. Okay, and in 1986, when I started my first company, okay, I was in the real estate business. I needed to have clients who were wealthy because those are the people who have real estate. I was in the commercial real estate business, right? So here I was working to get clients, wealthy clients, while at the same time holding this belief that they're all essentially a bunch of crooks. And I would do a presentation and then be like, nah, not going to work with you. And I never, of course, I never send a presentation. Okay, now for you, Mr. and Mrs. Crook, or Mr. and Mrs. Dishonest. I never said that, but somehow I think they felt that I held this belief. And it took me a while. I was like, wait a minute. This belief does not actually comport with my experience. Okay, so first of all, I had to realize I had that belief, and then I had to say, is this belief valid? And what I realized was, I knew a number of very wealthy people by then, because I worked in Jewish philanthropy, and they were all very decent people. I mean, I'm not saying they were perfect. They were like most other people. They worked hard. They did their best to be honest people. They, gave a lot of money to charity. They helped the community, etc. So I had to first understand my belief, or my beliefs, in this case, this belief about wealthy people. Okay, and then I had to understand, how is this affecting my behavior? What kind of norms did this establish for me? And then the next step was, is this valid? And if it's not valid, how do I change the belief? Okay, so that's the first part about becoming literate, is understanding ourselves. And it's very difficult to do. Okay, I don't think any of us ever get to perfect self-awareness or self-understanding. I wouldn't make that the goal, by the way. I think we want to have a solid understanding of ourselves. So how do we get it? Well, the first thing to do is to reach out to friends, close friends, okay? In this case, family members may not be so good because they're so close to us they may not be able to be objective enough in helping us understand our own beliefs, values, behaviors, and norms. But friends are separated from us enough that they should be able to help us understand them. Okay. I mean, I prefer doing these things either over a meeting or in a telephone call, but I have done some of it via email and text message, depending on who the person was. Okay. And I, like, at one point, this is a number of years ago now, I sent an email or a text message to, I think it was 4 or 5 of my friends, and I said, I'm working on understanding myself better. You know me well. What would you say are it was either 3 or 5 best traits and my 3 or 5 worst traits? Okay. And by the way, you get a window into other people too by how they'll respond to that. Okay. Some of my friends, responded candidly. And some were not really comfortable, especially, pointing out what they thought were my bad qualities. Okay. So it gives you an idea of how close they really feel, right? Okay. So that's the first step in becoming literate. The second is to work on our skills for understanding others' beliefs, values, behaviors, and norms. Okay. And the way we do that is by listening to other people, asking them questions and listening to the answers, showing a sincere interest in who the other person is, over and above the sort of, frivolous stuff that we talk about, sports or what's in the news or whatever, but really getting to know the person. Okay. Now, this is not something we're going to do in the vast majority of cases with someone we've only just met. Okay. And we have to be careful not to ascribe beliefs or values or behaviors or norms to somebody based on their appearance. Okay. So, I'll use a Jewish example. Hopefully that's it, right? So, I forget who I was talking to. I think it was last week. And I was joking around about, being Jewish and being, cheap, because that's like a stereotype of Jews is that we're careful with a dollar, all that, right? And you hear it all the time, especially in the sort of classic Jewish comics, right? So, 100 years ago, or well, let's see, 100 years ago, 120 years ago, when there was a big wave of Jewish immigration to this country, most of the Jews who came here were very poor. So they were very careful with a dollar. That's because they didn't have too many dollars, right? So, you could argue that that the stereotype was apt. These days, you probably want to be careful with that. And in fact, the person I was talking to, he was telling me that he had said to his wife, one of the reasons he likes talking to me is he likes my insight into business. And his wife got very upset. She said, "You can't say that about Kevin. He's Jewish." And so he was asking, he's like, "Do you consider that to be, prejudice?" I'm like, "No, I mean, we know each other well. I appreciate the fact that you think I have insight into business. It's fine." I said, "I don't think you said that because I'm Jewish. I think you said it because it was me, and we talk about business frequently, right?" So, we do want to be careful about assuming beliefs, values, etc., of other people based on, things like race or ethnicity or religion or whatever. Okay. We want to get to know the person as an individual, right? I always fall back on Viktor Frankl's famous saying, there are only, 2 races of people, the decent and the indecent, right? And I think that if we keep that in mind when we're dealing with other people, so then we can avoid stepping into at least some of the worst or most egregious, stereotypes, etc. Okay. So that's what we want to do next, is understand others' beliefs, values, behaviors, and norms as individuals. Okay. Now, they may tell you, well, I think this, and, because I grew up in, I don't know, India, or I grew up in, France or whatever, a lot of, Indians or a lot of French people, think this way. Okay. I mean, if they ascribe a particular belief they have, to their, cultural background, fine. That's for them. But we shouldn't assume them. We shouldn't assume them. Okay. So then the next step is be aware of potential areas for clashes. Okay. Now, here in the United States, right? If you put, a Democrat and a Republican in the same room, and especially if they don't know each other, you can probably bet that there is the potential for clashes, and in some cases there could be very, big clashes. I mean, it obviously it would depend on the character and behavior of the people, right? But in that case, their beliefs and values, right, are likely to be different, if not very different, okay, depending where on the spectrum of beliefs they are, right? So then it would fall to their behaviors and their norms as to whether, the clashes are going to remain, collegial, or whether they're going to be, more explosive, okay? Now, there's a reason why we want to give thought to potential areas of clashes, okay? And that is because we may be in a position where we have to deal with solving those clashes, either because they're happening between us and someone else, or they're happening between, say, two colleagues. Maybe both of them are direct reports, or maybe one is a direct report and a person who reports to the other person. And we've got to be able to help them work through those clashes, right? That's part of our job, okay? Especially as business owners, okay? And you can see in business today, and I'm gonna wrap up on this. We're not going to get through all of this today. We'll continue with it next week. But you can see today the results of how some of these clashes work out. Look at what happened with Bud Light, right? There was a clash there between how their marketing people wanted to promote the brand and how a large segment of their customers looked at the brand, right? And the consequences of that clash and Bud Light's inability to deal with it effectively, right, have had lasting consequences for Bud Light. And in fact, now Modelo has become the number one selling beer in the United States, right? It's really quite amazing. And then just to follow this a little bit more, to get to stay on this idea of cultural literacy. So Modelo's core consumers are Latinos. Okay. And if you have seen their advertising, especially going back a couple of years, you see it very much focuses on their core consumers. So, but over the last couple, maybe few years, as they started broadening their reach, they've been extremely careful to make sure that as they did so, they did not offend their core customers. And they've done it obviously extremely well, because they went from having the vast majority of their customers being Latino to having a very large percentage of them now being non-Latino, and as such have greatly expanded their business, and at the same time retained their core customers, right? So that's an example of how being culturally literate and competent has, on the one hand, really served Modelo, and on the other hand, has really hurt Bud Light. Okay. In Bud Light's case, they did not evidently think about the potential clashes of their marketing efforts. Okay. And with Modelo, they are very intentional about looking at for potential clashes and making sure as well as they can they avoid them. And the proof is in the pudding, as they say. They have avoided them. So gosh, our half hour is up. Didn't get to cover nearly as much as I thought we would, but that's okay. Like I said, we'll pick it up next week. And so before I do sign off, a couple things. One is, please join me tomorrow at 12:30 p.m. Pacific time, 3:30 p.m. Eastern time. My guest is Barry Zwarstein, and Barry is a combat medic, a former combat medic, I should say, a psychologist and an author. And he's going to be talking about how to make transitions. Okay. And we'll talk about his book as well. I think you will find him very interesting. Barry, you'll, if you get my emails, you'll see that Barry hails from down under Australia. So we've been, we've had a guest from other countries before, so Barry is going to continue in that tradition. So I invite you to join us live or catch us on our various social media streams. And then next week, we will be back on Monday with Trust and Estates Weekly at 10 a.m. Pacific. And Tuesday at 11 a.m. Pacific will be the next edition of Business Lessons from the Military. And then again on Wednesday of next week with the next episode of People Making Money. So I thank you very much for joining me. Signing off as I always do, wishing you a wonderful rest of the day. And Marie, darling, you are my belle. All the best, folks.